Hello, and welcome to the Postmodern Iconoclast. This is a podcast that destroys the false icons and idols of the digital age in search of more authentic esoteric spirituality. I am your host, Georgina Rose, and I discuss everything on the fringes of esoterica. And in this podcast, I'm doing a solo episode, so it'll just be me yapping at you about a question, an actual genuine philosophical question that I've been thinking on, and that is, what is the philosophy of witchcraft? So, when we talk about witchcraft, like everyone now, I think, knows that there are people in the modern world who identify as witches and who practice witchcraft, right? I run a blog on esotericism and occultism, so I've talked about witchcraft quite a bit myself, and I've spent quite a bit of time in covens for witchcraft. I've gone to witchcraft rituals. I was initiated into an occult order. Right. I've had a lot of experiences related to this stuff. I've known personally a lot of people who identify as witches. Now, I myself do not consider myself a witch. I consider myself an occultist and a perennialist, just putting my own bias out there. But I know a lot about witchcraft, and I've actually been rereading a lot of the core text that define witchcraft as a movement, the main writers and thinkers who are bringing witchcraft into the center. And a lot of people who identify as witches have not read this stuff, right? Like, let's be honest, like people who go on TikTok and watch like a crystal video and then call themselves a witch, like they don't really know what they're pulling from. But there is a rich tradition, and there are a lot of people who are witches who take it incredibly seriously, who join covens, who run groups, who it really is like their life, and they've devoted a lot of time to witchcraft. And so, as I was reading these things more and more, and I've been thinking about the idea, like, is there a philosophy to witchcraft for a while? Because a lot of people do say that witchcraft is not a religion, witchcraft is a practice, right? All witchcraft is a set of actions that you do, which by this definition, I myself would be considered a witch. And I've never actually really bought into that, because if people are using witch as an identifier, as a thing that they signal themselves, like, oh, what do you believe in? You're like, I'm a witch. Like that's not really like how you would define something that's a practice, right? Like if someone was like, what are you? You probably wouldn't say like a quilter, right? Like if you quilted, if that was a practice that you had, like you loved, knitting quilts, right? You probably wouldn't core identify as a quilter, and it wouldn't be so important to you, right? Because people who are witches, this is a very important aspect of who they are, their identity, their life. They practice holidays because they are witches, right? And so the idea that it's just a practice is wrong. Now, whether witchcraft can be considered a religion is actually quite debatable. And because of this, I think philosophy is a thing that people will agree with a little bit more. But I do want to explore the witchcraft as a religion debate, because I think there's a pretty good argument to say that witchcraft is a religion. Now, if it's a religion, there's inherently a philosophy to it. So these are not like contradictory concepts, but I think it's more objective to say there's a philosophy to witchcraft than witchcraft is a religion. Basically, religion is defined in a lot of different ways by academic scholarship and historians on religion, professors on religion, right? Those are generally the people who define these terms. Basically, they say that if something has a set of beliefs, a set of morals, a set of ideals, and ritual practices with it, it can be defined as a religion. And based on that, witchcraft 100% qualifies. I think the reason why a lot of witches do not call themselves religious is because witchcraft is not generally organized. Of course, certain types of witchcraft, like Wicca, are organized religions. But people who practice, say, eclectic witchcraft often don't identify with that just because it's unorganized. And because of this, witchcraft is kind of just like paganism, kind of a big tent community where there are a number of perspectives, but they do overlap. And I'm going to explore those differing perspectives as sort of like subcategories of the philosophy of witchcraft, because I think they do still have core undercurrents, even if they are kind of coming from different directions. But yeah, I mean, this is the big thing. Like, I also think a lot of people who are witches are uncomfortable with the term religion because they grew up, a lot of them grew up Christian and have a lot of problems with Christianity and their Christian upbringings. And so they don't want to use that term religion. Now, I also have known witches who come from Islamic or Jewish backgrounds. So, of course, that's not always the case. But I think for some people, it's like a kind of holding on to like bad memories from childhood. I've definitely seen that. Also, I think in the West, we assume religion has to look a specific way. Like we look at Muslims and we look at Christians and we say like, oh, that's religion. Like I've even heard people say things like Mormonism are not religions because they're cults, right? Which obviously doesn't make sense. If something's a cult, it would still be a religion, but whatever. Like, there's a lot of dispute about what a religion is. There are whole doctoral PhDs written about, like, how do we define religion? Philosophy is a little bit simpler to define, right? A philosophy is a way of thinking. And I will argue that witchcraft is not just a practice, but also a way of thinking. Because if you look at witchcraft practices and like why people do rituals certain ways, like there are clear underlying arguments for that. There are clear theological backings to that lend it to having a philosophy. And I also will say, I believe witchcraft has a moralistic undertone. There are specific morals that are related to witchcraft, and the way witchcraft is differentiated from other forms of magic, like in mysticism, ceremonial magic, other forms of occultism, is based on these principles. So yeah, let's talk about the philosophy of witchcraft, because I think witchcraft is a modern philosophy. Yeah, let's get into it. So to begin, the main thing that we need to discuss, point number one, is from that first definition I gave, right? A lot of people say witchcraft is a practice, not a religion. So, what's the first philosophical argument intrinsic to that claim? One, witchcraft is a practice, right? Let's just look at the first half of that sentence. Witchcraft is a practice. So, that inherently means that doing, action, and praxis are key to the witchcraft worldview. And so what's really interesting about witchcraft is outward facing, right? Unless you're talking about Wicca or the Cultus Sabbatii or specific organizations, you don't necessarily have to go through initiations or conversions or consecrations or dedications to become a witch, right? The central idea is, while of course for those traditions you do have to do that, generally you can kind of just do witchcraft out of your bedroom. And that's not some idea that's come up with on TikTok. People have been saying that for a long time. And so that intrinsically means that witchcraft is a philosophy of doing, right? You have to be taking action to be a witch. It's not something you can like passively believe in. And I actually see this when I look at like normies who call themselves witches, right? People who are not like really invested in these communities, who do identify with the label of witch. Is you do see some of them who kind of more believe in it, but even the people like that, like I knew this girl she called herself Wiccan. She'd never been to a coven, but even then, like she still did like little spells, like little jar spells and tarot readings and stuff, right? Like she was doing actions, and that is what defined her as a witch. And I knew another girl actually, same place, she identified as a witch as well. She did not identify as Wiccan, but she's like, yeah, I'm a witch. I do spells sometimes, and I'm like, okay, cool. So doing spells is essential. And so what's really interesting about this is witchcraft is an exoteric esotericism. So when we talk about like what defines a religion and religious frameworks, right? With every religion, there's an esoteric side and an exoteric side, right? The exoteric is the doctrinal teachings, which some of the stuff I'm going to talk about are actually kind of exoteric ideas of witchcraft. In a sense, I guess this podcast is kind of what is exoteric witchcraft. But esoteric is the practice and the doing. So to be part of exoteric witchcraft, you have to be doing the esoteric, which is this really interesting kind of like wild Ouroboros-shaped chaos of witchcraft, which is so interesting to me. But when you start doing these practices, you see very quickly that these practices have clear meanings. They have reasons why they have done. There are holidays, right? There is a whole thing attached to witchcraft that does extend beyond the actions. Because if you are doing the actions, right, you believe they happen, right? If you are doing a spell, you believe that spell is going to do something. And if you are doing a spell, you're putting a bunch of herbs in a jar, right? Those herbs must mean something. There must be a meaning. When I was a new occultist, one of the things that really stuck with me is I wanted to know why. Like I did these rituals. I actually started, ironically, as like a witch type a little bit, like regional witchcraft, right? And then I very quickly pivoted towards high magic, ceremonial magic, and I was part of Thelema for a very long time. And what pulled me was always, I wanted to know why. Like I would read these instructions and these rituals and I'd want to go, okay, but why does that happen? And while witchcraft is not as forthcoming about this stuff as traditions like Thelema that like immediately bring up true will and the great work and alchemical aims, witchcraft still has reasons. There are still clear things that go alongside with witchcraft. And every single person, every single one, without fail, who I have met, and I have known many witches personally, they have key philosophical alignments, no matter what tradition they are. I've known people who do like traditional witchcraft. I'm going to talk about traditional witchcraft versus Wicca a lot on this podcast because that's like two basically philosophic schools within the broader philosophy of witchcraft when you get into it. But I've known people on both of those camps. I've known people who practice regional folkloric witchcraft. I've known people who are eclectic witches. I've known a lot of witches, spent a lot of time with them. They all believe a lot of the same things. Like there's a lot of overlap no matter what angle they're coming at it. And that's just interesting to me. So I'm going to explore that and all the influences that are on witchcraft. God, this outline is crazy, by the way. You guys are going to really love this one. So yes, first part of the witchcraft philosophy is it is an exoteric esotericism. Now, I want to bring up those two distinctions because I'm going to talk about Wicca first, and then I'm going to move into traditional witchcraft. So, to subdivide the school of philosophy of witchcraft, I am going to make two big categories, and all witchcrafts can be kind of divided along this line, right? And a lot of people frame this as Wicca versus trad craft, or Wicca versus traditional witchcraft. Now, those terms are a bit reductive because there are other forms of witchcraft that don't necessarily call themselves Wicca that are kind of in this Wicca camp. So I'm gonna redraw the lines. We're going fun on this one. I've been doing a lot of thinking, okay, guys. So I'm gonna call it Wicca influenced or neo-pagan witchcraft and traditional witchcraft. So neo-pagan, trad. Those are my two lines. Because everything's going to fall on one side of those two lines. And I'm going to start with the Wicca or neo-pagan witchcraft camp first, because that is the larger camp. The majority of people who follow the philosophy of witchcraft are in that camp one. Now, to be clear, there was a lot of hair splitting amongst the witch community, a lot of debate amongst the witch community. They really fight a lot. And so a lot of people I'm going to put in this camp are going to be very pissed that I'm lumping them in with Wicca. And I'm going to make it clear, not everyone who feels this way will identify as Wiccan. But a lot of these core philosophic ideas that people who are neo-pagan witches, that includes eclectic witchcraft, right, have core Wiccan philosophical influence. So yeah, neo-paganism. Let's get into it. So the core of this is going to be Gerald Gardner. He is kind of the founder of this entire school of thought. And yes, all these people have Wicca influence on them. I'm saying it. So basically, Gerald Gardner is a British man. He's English. And he is going to really revolutionize everything and start, honestly, the modern witchcraft movement. I don't believe a lot of people would be calling themselves witches, even in the tradcraft camp, without Gerald Gardner. Gerald Gardner is polarizing, but, he's important. So I want to give some background on who Gerald Gardner was. Because despite a lot of people knowing these words like witchcraft, Wicca, not all people know who Gerald Gardner was and what he believed. So, Gerald Gardner, I want to go a little into his past, right? Before he began Wicca, he was a part of the Western esoteric movement. So, from about the 1880s to the 1950s, there was this period of time called the Magical Revival. And the Magical Revival was a movement that started in Europe. I would really say it started in England and then expanded through Germany, through the rest of Europe, and into places. There's some Russian people who also have influence on this. Basically, there was a renewed interest in magic, mysticism, the occult, and how to do practices to impact spirituality. Now, dialing back the clock a little bit further, right before the Magical Revival, there was this period of time called the Enlightenment. The Enlightenment was a big movement in Europe that was really started by the French Revolution, that was essentially the revolution of reason. This is where ideas like democracy really started coming into play. Egalitarianism, liberty, all of these ideas are Enlightenment ideas. And the Enlightenment really pushed rationality, reason, logic. And at the time, the Enlightenment and the church establishment were kind of at an ideological war. Monarchism and people who kind of held those pre-Enlightenment views really disliked the Enlightenment. They had a big problem with it. And basically, yeah, the Enlightenment really did a number on the power of Christianity within the Western consciousness. And the Enlightenment became sort of the core philosophy of the modern West, right? America, if you're an American, American ideals are all based on Enlightenment ideals. And the big thing with the Enlightenment is the Enlightenment was very reason-centric. And a lot of people who become the predecessors to ideas like atheism, deism was big at the time. Deism is kind of like a proto-atheism. Deism isn't all the way to atheism. Deism is basically the idea that there's a creator God, but then he left everyone alone and the world kind of rules itself, right? Those were all predecessor ideas. And the Enlightenment was a time of rationality. And rationality and spirituality clash in an interesting way because ideas like witchcraft, ideas like occultism, ideas where you can summon gods and have spiritual experiences are kind of counter to the Enlightenment. And so I see the Magical Revival as an interesting I don't know if I'd call it counter movement, but kind of. It was somewhat of a counter movement. So people who were in the magical revival still held a lot of like Enlightenment philosophical ideas, though not all of them, to be incredibly clear. There are a lot of big figures during the magical revival who straight up probably opposed the Enlightenment. I would say like the theosophical camp, not really Enlightenment-y, but there were a lot of people who were influenced by that. But the decline of Christianity as the only lens of viewing things through from this time, I do think kind of set the stage for the magical revival. Now, every time there's a big pro-reason, pro-rationality movement, there's often a re-enchantment after that. There's this really interesting book called The Myth of Disenchantment that basically argues that the idea that humanity is slowly moving towards a rational, disenchanted, not superstitious world is fundamentally incorrect. And the magical revival was a strong move towards mystical thinking, magic, all of these things. The magical revival is the movement that spawned Thelema, Hermeticism, Neoplatonism, Neo-Gnosticism, Rosicrucianism, Freemasonry, spiritualism, New Thought, and from that movement later on that would not be the same movement, you would get things like the New Age, right? So magical revival is going on, and magical revival people were typically like middle to upper class to high class people in Europe, right? And they were joining these secret societies, these fraternal orders. And getting initiated through them and being taught teachings from these organizations. There's some really interesting stuff going on where a lot of these organizations would reject the rationality and logic stuff of the Enlightenment, but they would retain like the general idea of trying to discover the truth through like a scientific method, right? There was this really interesting publication called the Equinox. It's a Hellenic publication that said very explicitly the goal was the method of science, the aim of religion. And that sort of idea led to this interesting rise of syncretism and bringing back older, archaic, pre-Christian traditions into people's minds, right? People were not just thinking through the Christianity lens. So the magical revival is really interesting because it's kind of counter-enlightenment, kind of enlightenment. Just wouldn't have happened without that, right? It's a very interesting period of time. And Gardner was in this wave, right? He was part of this. He was part of a group called the Ordo Templi Orientis, which is a Thelemic organization. Now, Thelema has a very established philosophy. Thelema identifies as a philosophy. Thelema has this core idea of the true will, which is basically the internal purpose of the self given by the divine. And through finding that through mystical engagement, which you can only find through mystical engagement, which is why praxis is so important. And that idea seeps heavily into witchcraft. That's why I believe esotericism is a good word to define witchcraft, because witchcraft, you cannot be a witch without practice, right? Thelema argues you cannot find your true will without ritual, right? Ritual as a necessity. And all of these traditions have this interesting emphasis on ritual as an important part of life, right? As society has moved on, ritual has become less central, right? Like when you, in the ancient world, right, you would have coming of age rituals, all sorts of rituals people would do, and that kind of was decreasing in the world, and these movements pushed it back in, saying that ritual is a fundamental need that people have, and through ritual you can align with archetypes and discover your consciousness. Ideas like the psychologist Carl Jung, I would also say, are products of this period of time. And Gardner's one of these people, right? Now, Gardner actually leaves Thelema before starting witchcraft, which is why witchcraft is not a Thelemic philosophy, but there is a heavy emphasis, like that praxis stuff, that true will stuff. Now, they won't use the word true will like that, but they'll use the term will in witch writings. Now, Gardner, when he really split was when he had this experience that he claims to have had. Now, you guys can fight in the comment section about whether this happened. This is highly debated. There's a book called The Search for the New Forest Coven by Ronald Hutton, the British academic who's the main scholar on neo-paganism and witchcraft. He has some really good lectures on YouTube. I really recommend checking out Ronald Hutton's work. He's really vital and has been a big influence on me making this podcast, actually. But basically, Gardner went and had an experience. The New Forest is a forest in southern England, and he was initiated into witchcraft, according to him, by a coven of witches who have been part of a acting coven since antiquity. Now, this actually comes from a writer, Margaret Murray, who's going to be a big impact on the philosophy of witchcraft. Basically, Margaret Murray she was originally an Egyptologist, but then she became a European folklorist who was very big in academia at this period of time. Margaret Murray wrote this seminal work called The Witch Cult of Western Europe that would really become like the founding academic thing that people would turn to and point to about witchcraft. She argued that during all of European history, there has been a surviving witch religion. She did use the word religion, which is very interesting. Basically, she said that despite how it seems Europe has become Christianized, there was actually a secret religion of witches that have been existing in pockets kind of on the fringes of society this whole time. And a lot of people will take Margaret Murray's historicism and say there was a thing called the burning times, where during all those witch burnings in European history, a lot of people in normal historicism do argue that they were just horrible mass hysteria, folie à deux events, right? They were just people going crazy. Now, Margaret Murray, and well, not necessarily her, but people who elaborate on her will say that it was called the Burning Times. And it was an intentional persecution of people who were in this witch religion or people who were midwives, people who kind of were adjacent to witchcraft. Now, whether or not there was a surviving witch cult is debatable, but, and I give this but here, a lot of what she talks about as things that represent this cult, this surviving religion, are going to be huge impacts on the philosophy of witchcraft and the collective mythology that created modern witch movements, right? Whether or not you think this is true, right? And there's a lot of people who would say this is a really horrible view because it says that like the witch persecutions were kind of justified. Because if this is true, then like in a sense, I guess the witch hunters were right, right? So you guys, it's very debatable, but that is an important thing to remember. We have to begin with this, the relationship to Christianity. So this kind of does put witchcraft in opposition to Christianity in a way. The people who are in the traditional witchcraft camp are going to really expand on that. But the Wiccan camp actually argues that it is not anti-Christian. That's not what they're saying. They're not saying like witchcraft is Satanism. Witchcraft is not Satanism, to be incredibly clear, but that witchcraft was persecuted by the Christian church as it was seen as a threat. So what was the witch cult of Western Europe allegedly believing and doing? So the witch cult of Western Europe, basically we get what they would have believed through the New Forest Coven and into Gardner. Gardner establishes Wicca, the witch religion. Wicca is like kind of an Anglo-Saxon word that means witch. And he actually created a very interesting way of looking at things where essentially what witchcraft is it's a religion. And he actually syncretized it with a lot of the Western esoteric stuff he was engaged with, where there is a god and a goddess. Now, the god represents the collective divine masculine, and the goddess represents the collective divine feminine. And so, a key philosophic point within witchcraft is the idea of the divine masculine and the divine feminine as these two sort of polarities that exist and sort of play in together. And the ultimate magical secret is to unite the polarities. So, this kind of does elevate women in a way that right at this time, especially in England, which was a bit more Protestant at this time, because Gardner really kicks into action in the 20s, 30s, 40s, and 50s. Protestant Christianity, there's not a lot of divine feminine influence. There is some in Catholicism and Orthodoxy, but not compared to ancient paganism. And this resurgent belief in the divine feminine and the feminine power are key to this. And a lot of the people who really have gotten involved in the witchcraft movement have been women who feel that the Christian tradition does not uphold or value the divine feminine and that it's really shrunk the divine feminine. Now, Gardner would bring in a lot of other ideas that are also kind of interesting. So, this idea of nature based religion comes in, and all witchcraft traditions hold this, right? A key philosophic notion is that nature is divine, right? There's divinity in nature. And when we look at human history, the first understanding, the most primitive understanding of religion is animism. Animism is the belief that there is a soul in everything, right? Everything is connected, right? The land, the trees, the wind, right? All of that has a spiritual power and nature to it. And if you look at religions of less evolved societies, right, you see a lot of animism there. Now, witchcraft takes animism and expands it and elaborates upon it, but that key idea is there. And so the veneration of nature is essential. And all pagan traditions, all neo-pagan traditions are going to take this on. And one of the key parts of the Wiccan religion is this thing called the Wheel of the Year, which is a set of 4, then 8 holidays that honor the changing of the seasons, the equinoxes, and sort of just honor the harvest and the turning of the wheel. And I like the phrasing, the turning of the wheel, because it shows another key idea within the witchcraft philosophy that would be, ironically, very kind of related to Carl Jung, a psychologist who is going to have a huge impact on the philosophy of witchcraft and the philosophy of esotericism as a whole, who believed in this thing called the life, death, rebirth cycle. As well, Jung believed in certain parts of the soul, like the shadow. And so a lot of Jungian philosophical and psychological ideas are part of the witch philosophy. But yes, like the turning of the wheel is the life, death, rebirth cycle that we see every single year. Gardner explained it through these kind of interesting narratives, and people like Farrar, who kind of expanded Wicca, would tell the story of the Oak King and the Holly King and a battle between the Oak King and the Holly King, and one representing the colder seasons of the year. Well, I guess not the colder seasons of the year, when the sun is showing less in the sky. So that would be from the summer solstice down to the winter equinox, and then from the oh my god, from the summer solstice to the winter solstice, from the winter solstice to the summer solstice, right? That would be summer solstice to winter. Is it getting darker? Winter to summer, is it getting lighter? And those would represent like death and life and the sort of human life cycle in this philosophic way. And that would be a key division of the year. And so we would see, like, we're seeing the cycle of nature, and we're animism style giving life to nature and then watching it give birth, watching it live, watching it die, and so on and so on. And that's why things like the lunar cycle are so intrinsic to the worldview of witchcraft, right? If you are a witch, you are honoring the turning of the moon, right? From the new moon to the full moon and back around, right? That is another sort of representation of this. And so we're getting this interconnected quality, right? That all is one type idea is a witch idea. And that's where you get things like why these spells work is often hinged on this thing called the law of correspondence or sympathetic magic. These are kind of similar ideas, so I'm just going to lump them together. And it's basically like everything corresponds to other things because everything is always connected. And if you do something with one thing, it will affect the other thing. So a good way to explain this is if you are trying to get motivation in your life, you would light a fire because the fire represents will. And so it happening there happens in the other space. There's an esoteric way of explaining this called as above, so below, or the relationship between the microcosm and the macrocosm. So the microcosm is our small world, our small lives, and the macrocosm is the universe, the broader world, the bigger picture. And so what happens in the microcosm can impact the macrocosm, which is what is happening in spell work. When a witch does a spell and they use like all these like herbs like St. John's wort, right? They're impacting the greater world through that relationship. Because if you look at things like astrology, which most people who are witches believe in astrology, I would say that's probably like kind of required if you consider this worldview as a holistic worldview and you adopt it and you consider like, why am I doing this? What does this mean, right? Astrology argues that the movements of the stars affect our mundane world. It's not because the sun is like, and the stars are like literally doing it. Like it's because of that interconnected relationship. And you can see the macrocosm move and the microcosm will move with it because they are literally dancing back and forth. And so when you do your ritual, it affects the macrocosm. When the stars move and they make astrology happen, the macrocosm is affecting the microcosm, right? It's a back and forth type relationship. And that idea is going to be key to how people think about witchcraft. Now, when it comes to the neo-pagan camp, I would like to talk about the morality of witchcraft because the neo-pagan camp definitely has morality and really pushes back on this idea because when we look at like how witchcraft is viewed, witchcraft historically has been viewed as quite evil, right? Like in the pre-Christian world, the sort of comparable terms to witch were essentially used for people who were doing magic that was kind of against the laws of society. Like in the ancient pagan world, there was illicit magic and there was illegal magic. And honestly, after paganism, this was true too. Like people were cool with John Dee, the Christian mystic, conjuring the angels, but they weren't cool with like women in the woods communing with nature spirits, right? There's always kind of been this idea of good versus bad magic within society, and the witch philosophy rejects this idea. And basically, when Wicca kicks off, is they're like, well, witch doesn't equal bad magic. We actually have morality. And there will be this poem written called The Raid. Now, Gerald Gardner did not write or come up with the Wiccan Raid, but essentially what the Wiccan Raid is this long form poem. And yeah, it basically argues that you should only do magic that benefits people, and what you put out comes back to you times three. Now, this is a similar idea to karma. Now, I will say a lot of people in this camp do not see it that literally. They do not believe in the back times three thing. Now, some people definitely do and take that very, very seriously. But generally, this idea of karma is going to come into play, right? This idea that like what goes around comes around, what we do will give us punishments. And so this inherently creates a morality, but Wicca and neo-paganism kind of have a different morality because they're rejecting Christian morality, right? Like a big thing that happened in Wiccan rituals is the use of sky-clad ritual or nude ritual. And this is actually explained in some traditional Wiccan writings and invocations. The reason why nudity is used in Wiccan ritual is to represent the freedom of the practitioner. Whereas if you look at like historic ritual function, like a lot of people in mysticism wear headscarves or veil during ritual. The reason why they wear the headscarf is to annihilate the self and humble the self before a god. Whereas if you are nude, you are representing freedom and not necessarily that idea of like submission, right? It's more like you are, and I'm not going to say equal to the god because you still praise the goddess. You still call the goddess great. There's no like, oh, well, we are gods. Like, that is not what witches believe, but it's less of a subordination vibe, a bit less of that, and more like a reverent vibe. And this idea of freedom is going to be central, right? And there's also within the skyclad idea, a lot of people talk about it as a return to nature, right? A rejection of the Christian worldview and a return to an ancient naturalistic worldview where people were one with nature, one with animals. And there's this interesting thing within witchcraft discussions where you see a attack on human centricity. So in general consciousness, we see the human as a thing that is distinct from nature, a thing that is distinct from animals. And Christianity will argue that humans are distinct from nature and distinct from animals because humans contain free will. Because within the Christian religion, the only thing that has free will, not even the angels, not even the demons, is humanity. Humans are the only creature with free will. Now, this idea does not exist in pagan traditions. It does not exist within witchcraft traditions. And in fact, I would say witchcraft attacks this idea, right? What are animals? Animals are nude. What are witches? Witches are nude, right? It's a reversion away from human centricity. And you will see a veneration of land spirits, a veneration of nature spirits, a return to gods like Pan, the god of the wild hunt, right? A return to nature and a rejection of the idea that we are detached from nature at all. A resynchronization of the human with the animalic, right? We are going back to that. We are stepping away from this idea. And you'll see a lot of witches write about how arrogant it is to think we are, somehow above animals. And so respect for animals, respect for nature, a consciousness where you're caring about the environment are key to like neo-pagan ideas. And that like transcends outside of like witchcraft, because to be clear, not all pagans are witches. Not all pagans agree with these ideas, but that rejection of human centricity is pretty big. Now, another thing that comes in is like ancestry and pre-Christian ideas. So obviously, we kind of see this idea that witchcraft, whether or not you believe it is literal, is a return to pre-Christian beliefs, right? And so when you read texts that have been really influential on witchcraft, I'm going to talk about The White Goddess. So The White Goddess is a book that isn't recommended much now, but really kind of set the tone for a lot of witch discussions. It's a book by a historian named Robert Graves. He was an English historian. A lot of these people are from England. Ronald Hutton actually had a really interesting point where the certain socioeconomic things going on in England is why England was the country to be sort of the originator of a lot of witch philosophy and witch traditions. Hutton kind of argued that, like, basically a lot of people at this time in England were romanticizing the countryside and kind of getting disillusioned with cities. Now, I am not English. I do not live in the United Kingdom, so I don't exactly know how true that is, but I trust Ronald Hutton's judgment. But he has talked a lot about, like, there were specific reasons why England, of all places, had this going on. But basically, he wrote this book about mythology and poetry. It was published in the 1940s, and it basically goes through, like, the history of European mythology, and it links it in interesting ways. He also, and this idea is really going to underlie that idea of like the goddess and the divine feminine, that there was this entity called the White Goddess who sort of transcended across European myth, European societies, that was like the goddess of Europe. He also wrote a lot about Druidic stuff and really brought this like Celtic interest in, because Wicca actually does pull a lot from Celtic myth. But what's really interesting about the White Goddess, because I actually reread it very recently, like literally this week, the White Goddess argues that this cult kind of also extends into the Near East a bit and pulls from like some Near Eastern and some Etruscan type mythology. It kind of syncretizes everything together and creates like a across Europe kind of pagan mythos. It unites it. And that's why you see like this heavy syncretism. And syncretism is big in witchcraft. Now, not all witches are syncretic, but this idea of eclecticism, I don't think would be a thing if there wasn't such syncretism in these early texts that really define witchcraft. Like the White Goddess like brings up like the Near East, Turkey, Greece, Italy, the Nordic countries, and a lot, of course, about Western Europe. It all links it together and talks about all these gods as linking. It's a very soft polytheism, really. And in general, I would say witchcraft veers towards soft polytheism, excluding a few outlier traditions. But it's very interesting stuff. And you see this sort of turn back towards some of these older ideas. And that means that these older texts from these pagan religions are going to have some weight. Like I see a lot of people who are witches who recommend and bring up a lot of philosophic influence from a Nordic text called the Havamal. The Havamal is a Nordic pagan text. Reconstructionist pagans are also going to use this stuff too. And it outlines a lot of like laws and beliefs of the Nordic people and is very kind of doctrine-y. It's the closest thing we can kind of get to a pagan doctrine. Like I was having a conversation on Twitter the other day about like, what would the Bible of paganism be? What would our like outlining doctrine be? And someone brought up the Havamal because the Havamal kind of has rules, and a lot of these other texts are like mythic epics like the Eddas. Like there's a lot of mythic reverence. The reading of mythology is a big part of witchcraft, and mythic archetypes, initiation, all of that is going to come in. Like I would say archetypal belief is a big part of witch philosophy, and the ability that you can kind of embody archetypes, take on archetypes, and bring that into your life. Now, there's another text, and this is where I'm going to pivot towards traditional witchcraft and the philosophical things of that side of the camp, is through this text called Aradia. So Aradia is going to be a big game-changing text. Now, Aradia is a wild, wild book. So it is from 1899. The folklorist and American, the first American we're seeing in this conversation, Charles Godfrey Leland found this. So he claims he found this. And it's from Tuscany. And it was according to him, the actual doctrinal faith text of these witches in Tuscany and the religion they believed. And he argued that they were one of the witch cult of Western Europe, I guess the witch cult of the Mediterranean in this case, that have survived since antiquity and kept it going. And when we look at Aradia, there's a lot of wild stuff in this text. I mean, it has like direct instructions about like liturgy, it has techniques, and there's been a lot of debate about this text. There's a lot of like folk rituals in it, and yeah, it's got a big influence on it. There are some spells, all this stuff. Now, this book is very philosophical and very polarizing. This is a good way to get people pissed off, is to talk about this text, because it really kind of like Wicca has a very love and light, like we are a nice, friendly, loving religion vibe to it. Aradia kind of throws that shit out. Like Aradia is done with that, and Aradia takes the perspective on Christianity a bit harsher, right? Aradia is not as like, well, we're pre-Christian, we just don't have anything to do with Christianity, we were wrongfully persecuted, and straight up kind of says like the religion of witchcraft is opposed to Christianity in some way. Very provocative. A lot of criticisms of Christianity are brought up in this book. Wild stuff. So basically, this has a god and goddess thing going on as well, like the idea that there's a god and a goddess still in this. And the thing that's wild is within Aradia, oh boy, this is going to get crazy. He talks about a witch messiah named Aradia. That's where the name is from. Aradia is the daughter of the god and the goddess of Aradia, Gospel of the Witches. And Aradia came to women and I guess men as well. It's not super specific. And taught them witchcraft and very heavily critiqued the Catholic Church. Aradia, basically like was against the church, and Aradia is like a witch messiah. It's pretty wild stuff. There is some Italian folklore that explores Aradia. So Aradia has some basis. Now, Aradia as a witch messiah is really like this text thing. 99% of witches, I don't think I've ever met a witch who like worships Aradia or like really cites this text. But the reason why I'm bringing this up is a lot of these ideas that I'm going to bring up after this really come from erotia, because what is erotia? Erotia is a transgressive text. And so when we get to this school of thought known as traditional witchcraft, this idea of transgression is going to become incredibly important. So traditional witchcraft, there are kind of two figures associated with this. They ran different organizations. They were not the same person, but they kind of wrote about similar stuff. And they're both cited, depending on who you ask, as the two founders of traditional witchcraft. I'm going to start with Paul Hewson. Paul Hewson is a occultist and witch who wrote, the most important thing he wrote was a book called Mastering Witchcraft. Mastering Witchcraft is kind of like, it's interesting because you get witchcraft today as like the text of Gardner that taught people witchcraft. Mastering Witchcraft is his attempt, and Mastering Witchcraft is inflammatory. It's kind of fun to read, like a little bit. It's very Nietzschean. I would say Mastering Witchcraft is fundamentally like there's a heavy Nietzsche influence on that. I don't know if Hewson would say that himself, but yes, like ideas like will are there, and he talks a lot about transgression. And he doesn't even just like bring up witchcraft as a pre-Christian thing. Like he talks about ideas like the witch's Sabbat. And that's gonna be a big thing in traditional witchcraft. And yeah, like he really also, the other thing about Hewson that's weird is he really teaches a lot of like Western ceremonial lodge magic. Like when I was reading Mastering Witchcraft, I was very surprised because there's a lot of like straight up ritual magic. And I actually have another text Hewson wrote called Liber Spiritum, which is like a scan of his personal grimoire. And it's like straight up just Western ritual magic. Like it's the stuff you would learn in like the Golden Dawn and like Renaissance traditions. So yeah, there's still that heavy Western esoteric influence. Like that doesn't really go away in any of these traditions. Like witchcraft and Western esotericism are really linked. Some people really are like, well, we have nothing to do with that. And that's like clearly a lie, because all of these people, every single time, like, the connection map, like if I were to make a conspiracy map on the wall, like Western esotericism comes in every single time without fail. Paul Hewson really sees witchcraft as oppositional to Christianity. There's a lot of this stuff like about disconnecting yourself, like you have to do rituals to like transgress against your previous religious background, no matter what that is. He doesn't really clarify what like that would be, but he talks about like kind of unchaining yourself from a previous religion. And he also really emphasizes the power of the mind. Like his rituals are less like this correspondence represents this thing, though his ceremonial ones kind of are, and more like a rejection. And this idea of transgression is going to become key to all of these traditions, right? And that's why I think you see, and actually that is why, I'm not even going to say you think, because I know I'm correct on this, Hecate as a big like mother of the witches, and a lot of witch organizations really cite Hecate. Because when we look at ancient Greek religion, like what was the goddess of the outsiders? Who represented them? That was Hecate. Hecate was the transgressor. And Hecate was actually identified as the goddess of witchcraft in ancient Greece. Now, they identified her with a lot of other stuff and honestly brought up the other stuff more. When we talk about modern witchcraft, like we're really getting to, Hecate as this, representation of witchcraft, right? Now, the idea of liminality also comes up a lot. Like, we are really seeing the liminal, the in-between, like witchcraft as a transgressive liminal thing, right? And a lot of witches will define witchcraft. Like the thing that defines witchcraft versus other forms of magic is that it's transgressive and liminal. All of that comes from these writers. Now you get to Chumbly. So Chumbly is the founder of an organization called the Cultus Sabbati, which is a very important witch organization. And he really brought the lore of the witch's Sabbat back into witchcraft. The witch's Sabbat was a thing that Christian writers talked about it a lot. That basically, and this is a big thing used to persecute witches, is like women would slip out of their body and like use illegal drugs like datura and hembane, and they put it on broomsticks and shoved it up their vaginas, and then went on mystic spirit journeys to unite with the devil and like have sex with the devil and do all this blasphemous, crazy things. Now, Chumbly's going to bring this back in. This was really not brought up in neo-paganism, but what Chumbly argued is that no, it's not any of this like, how they're talking about it. What it is like witches are using entheogenic herbal things like datura and hembane to induce a trance, and then in their dreams or in that trance state, they have a vision of dancing with other witches, and this represents like their initiation, and it's an initiation. It's not like we're all having an orgy with the devil, and it's been maligned. And all of you Wiccans are kind of playing into the Christian hands by saying, like, no, 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 we have nothing to do with that. Like, and this idea has actually kind of permeated all of witchcraft. Like, witches' Sabbath really is a thing that people believe in practice through trance and through pathworking. Pathworking is going to be big in traditional witchcraft. Pathworking, it's brought up a lot when people talk about Hermetic Kabbalah, but it's basically like going into deep meditative trances and then following through these journeys. And going through all of that. Now, another thing that the traditional witchcraft philosophy really brings up is witchcraft as the opposer, as the heretic, as the outlaw, as the under member of society, right? Like, the witch is the other, right? The witch is not mainstream society. The witch is not accepted. The witch is the outsider. And that's why I think a lot of people are also drawn to witchcraft, even if they don't know this as like a philosophic thing. And so if we're considering that, like, the witch is the other, the witch is as the opposer, you get into Tantra and you get into ideas like the left-hand path. So within Tantra and Hinduism broadly, there's an idea called the right-hand path and left-hand path. This is brought up really crappily in Western esotericism and just kind of used to mean edgy, but it actually does mean something in Hindu tradition, where basically the right-hand path is things that are not taboo, standard religious expressions, and then the left-hand path is like things that are taboo and going against the general religious order. The most extreme of this is a sect called the Agoris, who do all these crazy rituals with like dead people and shit and just all the taboos. They love taboos. And the core of really Tantra is the idea of the taboo. Now, not all of them are like doing dead people shit magic, but I mean, some of them are. I'm not going to deny that. I'm kidding. No, only some people. That's like one group, and not many people do dead people shit magic. But the idea of exploring taboos is a big part of like this tradcraft way of thinking. And I mean, what is the greatest taboo? The greatest taboo is the disconnection of the spirit from the body. And that's why astral projection and dream work are big parts of the sabbatic tradition. Like, Chumbley did a lot of dream magic. And his his successor, Shulky, who now runs that organization, talks a lot about plants and ritual drug use and entheogens and psychedelics as ways to sort of transgress and essentially leave the body, and experience like spirit interactions. So yeah, leaving the body, out of body experiences are a big part of this. Now, that general idea of like Tantra and Tantric philosophy talking about exploring taboos really does influence all of this. And actually, if you look at Chumbley's influences, he really liked Austin Osman Spare, the creator of Chaos Magic, and Kenneth Grant, who was a weird Typhonian Thelemite. Thelema is weird Thelema, but there's some weird Tantra stuff going into Typhonian Thelema. I do not have the time to explain Typhonian Thelema or the sanity to explain Typhonian Thelema right now, but it's crazy. Like, it's weird tantric influences, all sorts of crazy stuff going on. But yes, there is actually a tantric philosophic influence on this type of witchcraft. Now, I would say the majority of witches are not remotely related to tradcraft. It is a specific set of people who really dive into this stuff, and it's specific organizations that do it. They see themselves as like the enemies of Wicca. They have nothing to do with Wicca, blah, 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 but they're not. That's not true. Now, a lot of people across these camps, and this is something I guess I haven't explored, is regionalism. So the idea of looking at your region, understanding your region, and understanding a spiritual tradition of your region is a thing that is very popular now in witchcraft, and probably is part of the witch philosophy at this point, is understanding the history of your region, the spirits of your region, and the idea that every place has a spiritual body to it, right? Every land, every nation, every river, every town has a spiritual component to it. And learning to connect to the land and live in harmony with and sink into the land and the spirit of the place is going to be central. So, God, there's so much more I can say. I'm like running up on the end of my podcast, and I have more rant to do. I honestly, I don't want to talk for 3 hours, so I think I'm actually going to cut it here. If you guys would like a part 2, please comment below. I actually think I need to do a part 2 about this, because there's actually more parts of witch philosophy that I want to discuss. I want to discuss like hexing, morality, like should we curse people, ethics, because ethics within witchcraft. Actually, I think part 2 should be an ethics within witchcraft discussion. But yeah, those are the key beginnings to witch philosophy. There's so much more that I have to say. So this is my first time ever saying I need a part 2, but I think it would be way too long if I kept going. So I'm going to cut it here. I hope that gave a beginning introduction to witch philosophy and what witchcraft is, what witchcraft believes, and why I think there is a philosophy to witchcraft. Because if we think about everything I've been saying, right? We're seeing key themes. We're seeing philosophic influences. We're seeing beliefs. I think it is wrong to define witchcraft as a practice. And the more I've been thinking about this, the more I've been, driving myself into mystical fever trying to understand witchcraft, the more I'm certain that it is almost wrong to even argue that witchcraft conceivably could just be a practice. Because it's not. It's totally not. And there's so much going on. And yeah, got into some of the controversial stuff there that not everyone wants to talk about. Like, I think a lot of Wiccans listening to this will not like that I brought up the traditional witchcraft stuff. A lot of people will be mad that I lump them in with Wiccans. Yeah, I mean, I'm just really getting polarizing now. I guess it's my podcast. I can do what I want. Anyways, I've been Georgina Rose. I host the Dot Darling YouTube channel. I write a Substack. I actually recently wrote about the Wheel of the Year, which is very related to this subject if you found this interesting. I'm on Twitter, TikTok, though TikTok might be getting banned. I don't know. For all I know, I will still have a TikTok when this podcast comes out. Instagram. Yeah, I'm everywhere. This podcast is on podcasting platforms and on YouTube. If you're on a podcasting platform, please leave a review. If you're on YouTube, please like, comment, subscribe. And I'll see you all in the next one. Have an amazing day, night, afternoon, mid-morning, mid-evening, whatever time it is, wherever you are. Bye.